as China's claims over India's easternmost state of Arunachal Pradesh get shriller and what the MEA calls more absurd, the US now wades in, says it backs India's territorial sovereignty in Arunachal Pradesh. But the bigger question is Beijing preparing for a bigger and broader confrontation over the boundary, and how do Bhutan-China boundary talks fit into this scenario? Hello and welcome to Worldview at The Hindu with me, Suhasini Haidar. This week, we're going to look at some of the geopolitical and also the geospatial angles of the India-China military standoff at the line of actual control, remember, and these have been there since April 2020, so nearly 4 years ago. But first, the latest developments in the last week on the LAC. To begin with, Prime Minister Narendra Modi made a visit to Arunachal Pradesh on March the 9th to inaugurate a number of projects, including most notably the Sela Tunnel, a 1.5 kilometer tunnel at a height of 13,000 feet. It's meant to be an all-weather access to Tawang and especially meant for military troops heading to the line of actual control with China. Within days of that, China's foreign ministry and then its defense ministry spokespersons had issued statements making claims. They'd registered protests with Delhi, made claims on Arunachal Pradesh, even suggesting that the Prime Minister's visit would quote-unquote disrupt India-China talks to resolve that 4-year-old military standoff. India's response to both were equally sharp, the MEA calling the claims absurd, asserting Arunachal Pradesh as an integral part of India. Significantly then, this happened. The US State Department waded in to the spat, saying it recognizes Arunachal Pradesh as a part of India. Now those comments, and it's not the first time they're making them, but they are interesting because while many in India welcomed them, it would also be, could also be a double-edged sword if the US begins to recognize individual parts of India and talks about what it feels on Jammu Kashmir, Ladakh, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, etc. Delhi and Washington haven't always had the same stand on those. Meanwhile, the big diplomacy moves this week were of India and Bhutan. All the images really coming from there as Bhutanese Prime Minister Tshering Tobgay first visited New Delhi and then went to Bombay, and Prime Minister Modi then headed to Thimphu in practically back-to-back visits. Mr. Modi's visit was particularly significant as by convention, remember, Indian prime ministers do not travel abroad after elections have been announced, as they were last week. He went despite having to put off the visit by a day due to the weather in Bhutan as well. Now, while the ostensible reason for that visit being held at all costs was to receive this award from the Bhutanese king, Jigme Khesar Namgyal Wangchuk, it's called the Order of the Druk Gyalpo. The important discussions with both the king as well as his father, the former king Jigme Singye Wangchuk, is understood to be discussing bilateral issues like hydropower, investment in infrastructure, very particularly Bhutan's Gyelephu Mindfulness City project, we've spoken about that before, and importantly, Bhutan-China boundary talks and the direction they will take now. Remember, China's claims over Arunachal have become shriller and more determined in the last few years. To just take a look at all that Beijing has done. First, China has been renaming Arunachal Pradesh in its maps as Zhangnan, or what it calls South Tibet. It also published a series of new maps with Chinese names, opinion names for Arunachal towns, despite the fact that they are all firmly in Indian territory and control. China routinely protests visits by Prime Minister Modi, as we saw, Defense Minister Rajnath Singh to the state, also by dignitaries and even the US ambassadors visit there. Third, China continues to build border villages, which India believes are dual purpose for military use as well. And this in possible preparation for operations at the LAC. Remember, in recent years, China has passed laws that more or less allow it to claim land where it has settled population. So this is an area for worry. Of course, India is also speeding up border infrastructure, improving villages along the LAC. But Beijing's intentions towards the region, given how it has made assertions in the South China Sea and Taiwan, definitely become the growing worry. There is an important paper, in fact, if you'd like to read it online, brought out by the Takshashila Institute, that's based in Bangalore, where you can look at how two of the border areas, The villages are coming up, and they've used geospatial imagery looking at 2020 to now. Speaking recently, here's what External Affairs Minister Jaishankar said at a conference in Tokyo. And it really talks about how India has to deal with this challenge. Listen in.
Our own experience in the case of China, for example, is between 1975 to 2020, which is really 45 years, there was no bloodshed on the border. And in 2020, it changed. And today, when we look at the, we can disagree on many things, but when a country actually sort of does not observe written agreements with a neighbor, then I think you have cause for concern here, because it then raises a question mark about the stability of the relationship and, frankly, about intentions.
External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar there, speaking about China, but perhaps holding some punches. Let's talk then about just a little bit about the Bhutan-China talks and how this kind of gets involved with the larger question between India and Bhutan. And if you take a look at the map, it becomes a lot clearer. The talks between Bhutan and China on the boundary began in 1984. The two sides have held 25 rounds of talks, mainly over the resolution of two valleys to Bhutan's north. They're called Jakarlung and Pasamlung, and Doklam to the west of Bhutan. That's just above the Tri-Junction area with India. Now, Bhutan and China don't have full diplomatic ties. They don't maintain embassies. But Bhutan and the Tibetan Autonomous Region, because remember, it is really Tibet that abuts all these regions, they share a contiguous border to Bhutan's north and west of about 470 kilometers. Therefore, Bhutan is keen to demarcate this boundary, and China is keen now to push for a swap, where it keeps the dominant part of the Doklam Plateau instead of those northern valleys. Now, talks had come to a standstill between the two countries in 2016, followed by the India-China Doklam standoff in 2017. Subsequently, the COVID pandemic slowed things down. Then in 2020, China laid a brand new claim on Sapteng to Bhutan's east, which also abuts Arunachal Pradesh. So this is where you see the Arunachal Pradesh question coming in. Effectively, by laying claim to that land abutting Bhutan's east, China is also laying claim on India's Arunachal western boundary and effectively putting pressure on Bhutan to make progress on talks on those two areas or instead face this kind of new claim to the east. So once talks restarted in 2021, Bhutan and China seem to be making quick progress. They signed a 3-step roadmap to demarcate the boundary in 2023. Bhutan and China, and that was in 2021. In 2023, Bhutan and China signed a cooperation agreement for the joint technical teams that would carry out and mark the demarcated boundaries on both paper and on the ground. In January 2024, with a new government of Tshering Tobgay at the helm, reports have come in, and these are reports that the MEA has declined to comment on yet, that have suggested that Bhutan has actually requested India to hold off on its Arunachal road construction, a very specific point of it that goes via the Bhutanese Trashiangse district to Tawang until those talks are completed. Given all of the signs, India's diplomatic challenges are set to multiply over the next few months on the LAC for a number of reasons if you look analytically. One, China is increasingly upping its responses to India. The worry is that during India's election season, there may be attempts to destabilizing operations at some point of the LAC. Secondly, the US too is going into its election season, which could turn even more turbulent as Trump makes gains and the US's gaze turns inward. So similar worries remain about Chinese plans at other parts of its geography. The third reason, Bhutan now has to decide with a new government in place how quickly to proceed on its talks on the boundary. Given that Bhutan has now announced its ambitious plans that are kicking off for Gelefu, a 1,000 square kilometer special administration area, and they would want to stabilize their boundaries at the earliest. And fourth, India's other neighbors will be watching this very closely given their own economic ties with China, like the Maldives, for example, where the new government is getting closer to Beijing. Both Pakistan and Sri Lanka as well are looking for economic stability. They both dealt with extreme crises. The fifth reason, Chinese tensions in the Indo-Pacific region, most recently we saw with the Philippines, could cause maritime instability as well. So what's Worldview's take? China's growing loud responses on Arunachal Pradesh are a cause both for concern and for vigil, militarily and diplomatically for New Delhi. Eventually, India's 3,500-kilometer LAC with China as a whole is going to need more resources, and the worry is that this will strain India's other defense commitments and modernization, including in the maritime sphere. Therefore, the government needs to broadly acknowledge the threat and be much more transparent about how it plans to counter China's incursions that it has yet to fully acknowledge since 2020. Time for some Worldview reading recommendations. The first is this book called Understanding the India-China Border, The Enduring Threat of War in the High Himalayas. This is by Manoj Joshi. I've spoken about it before. It's particularly important for you to get a sense of where all the maps are, where all the regions of concern are. This other new book called Crosswinds, Nehru, Zhou, and the Anglo-American competition over China. This really looks at the past. This is by former Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale, but it has important points in there about that triangular relationship between the US, China, and India. A third book called Beyond Binaries has come out. It's called The World of India and China from 2008 to 2022. This is by a journalist called Shastri Ramachandran. It's certainly an unusual take and worth reading. Another book, it hasn't yet come out. In fact, there's a fear that it has been held up indefinitely, but it's worth looking out for, called 4 Stars of Destiny, an autobiography. And this is by India's former Chief General Manoj Mukund Narawane. Now, he was, of course, the chief when those 2020 incursions occurred. So whatever he writes about that will be very, very significant. There's this book called China's Worldview, Demystifying China to Prevent Global Conflict. This is by David Daokui Lee. And why it's important is this is a Chinese economist with Tsinghua University, and he's talking about China's engagement in the next few years with the West. Now, whether or not you dial down some of the pro-China rhetoric in that book, it is important to see where China's strategy seems to be headed. And then this book just out called The Return of Great Powers, Russia, China, and the Next World War by Jim Shoto. He's, of course, an American journalist. He's written about Trump and called it the madman theory in the past. And another look from the American rhetoric point of view. We hope you find all of these books, most of them are brand new, worth reading. And do join us again here on Worldview from the team. Thanks for watching.